The conference room held 12 people, but only one of them mattered to Douglas Caldwell, and it was not his wife. He stood at the head of the long mahogany table, morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him, casting his silhouette in gold. His voice carried the practiced warmth of a man who had spent decades learning how to make difficult announcements sound like gifts. "Marin," he said, "we think it is time for you to step back from the operational side." She sat 3 chairs down from him, a stack of project files open before her. Files she had organized. Files containing work she had supervised. Her pen stopped moving, but her expression did not change. Douglas continued as if he had not just rearranged her life without consultation. "The firm is growing. We need fresh energy in leadership positions. Eleanor has demonstrated remarkable vision, and I am pleased to announce that she will be stepping into the partner role effective immediately." Across the table, Eleanor Vance smiled with the careful gratitude of someone who had rehearsed this moment. She was 34, polished, and had been with the firm for 3 years. Marin had trained her personally. The room offered polite applause. Someone mentioned champagne. Douglas beamed at the assembled staff as though he had just delivered wonderful news to everyone present. Marin closed her file folder with a soft click. She looked at her husband of 30 years and said nothing at all. What she did instead was more devastating than any words could have been. She simply returned to her notes, pen moving across paper, as though the announcement concerned someone else entirely. As though she had already known this was coming. As though she had been waiting. Douglas faltered for just a moment. He had expected something. Gratitude, perhaps. Or gentle protest that he could magnanimously override. Her silence was not in his script. He recovered quickly, moving on to quarterly projections and client updates, but something in the room had shifted. The junior architects exchanged glances. The administrative staff studied their tablets with unusual intensity. Everyone had felt it, even if no one could name it. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. People filed out with the shuffling efficiency of those eager to discuss what they had witnessed somewhere private. Eleanor lingered near Douglas, touching his arm, laughing at something he murmured. Marin gathered her files and walked to the door. She did not look back. "Welcome back to another powerful story, my beloved listeners. Kindly tell me where you are watching from and what time it is where you are at. If you are new here, prepare for a story of betrayal, unexpected love, and what truly makes a family. Drop everything and listen closely. This tale of heartbreak and redemption might just change how you view love and family forever." To understand the weight of that conference room moment, you need to understand what Marin Caldwell had built and what she had surrendered to build it. She met Douglas when they were both 26 years old, graduate students at a small architecture program that valued historic preservation over flashy modernism. He was brilliant in the way that charmed professors and intimidated peers, full of grand visions and grander speeches. She was meticulous in the way that actually got buildings saved, spending hours in county records offices tracking ownership histories and structural assessments. Their first project together was a condemned Victorian on the outskirts of the city. The Historical Society had given up on it. The City Council had scheduled demolition. Douglas saw it and declared it could be magnificent. Marin saw it and understood exactly what would be required to make that magnificence real. She spent 3 months researching the original architect, tracing the family who had commissioned it, documenting every remaining original feature. She wrote the grant applications. She negotiated with the contractors. She sat in city council meetings and presented evidence with the quiet persistence of someone who knows she is right and does not need to shout about it. Douglas gave the final presentation. He stood before the council and spoke about vision and legacy and the soul of a city. He was magnetic. He was convincing. He was the one they remembered. The Victorian was saved. It became a landmark. Their names appeared together on the plaque, but only one of them was mentioned in the newspaper article. This became their pattern. They married in a church that Marin had personally lobbied to have placed on the historic register. Her family had been in preservation work for 3 generations. Her mother had taught her to see buildings as living things, repositories of memory that deserved protection. Her grandfather had written one of the first comprehensive guides to identifying architectural significance in threatened structures. When they founded Caldwell and Associates, it was Marin's family money that provided the initial investment. It was her family's connections that brought the first clients. It was her reputation in preservation circles that gave them credibility before Douglas had established his own. But Douglas was the face. Douglas was the voice. Douglas was the one who accepted the awards and gave the interviews and gradually, so gradually that she did not notice it happening, became the sole name people associated with their shared work. She did not mind. Not at first. She preferred the work to the spotlight. She liked being the one who knew every permit regulation, every zoning exception, every city council member's particular concerns. She liked being the person clients called when they needed real answers instead of inspirational speeches. The problem was that preference became expectation, and expectation became erasure. By their 20th anniversary, Douglas had stopped introducing her as his partner. She was his wife, which somehow meant something less. By their 25th, he had stopped consulting her on major decisions. By their 30th, he was announcing her demotion in front of the entire staff as though it were a favor. And she had let it happen. Year by year, compromise by compromise, she had let it happen. But that morning in the conference room, something finally broke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. It simply stopped working, like a mechanism that had been grinding for too long finally giving way to silence. She returned to her office after the meeting and closed the door. It was a corner office, or it had been. 3 days earlier, Douglas had mentioned that Eleanor would need more space, and would Marin mind terribly moving to the smaller suite down the hall. He had framed it as a question, but the movers were already scheduled. Marin sat at her desk and opened her laptop. Her hands were steady as she navigated to a folder she had created 6 months ago, when she first noticed the irregularities in the firm's financial records. She had labeled it simply research, knowing that no one else ever looked at her files anyway. Inside were scanned copies of every founding document of Caldwell and Associates. Copies of every contract she had negotiated. Copies of every client communication that documented her role in major acquisitions. And copies of 3 amendments to the firm's ownership structure that bore her signature. Except she had never signed them. She had discovered the forgeries 4 months ago, during a routine review of their corporate filings. Someone, presumably Douglas's attorney, had altered her ownership percentage in the firm. What had once been an equal partnership was now 70-30 in his favor. The paperwork was dated over 3 different years, spread out to avoid detection. She had not confronted him. She had not raged or cried or demanded explanations. Instead, she had done what she had always done. She had researched. She had documented. She had prepared. Now, sitting in the office she was about to lose, she opened a new email and typed a single line to her personal attorney. It is time. The weeks that followed were a study in controlled withdrawal. Marin moved to the smaller office without complaint. She organized her files with the same meticulous attention she brought to everything, labeling boxes and updating digital records as though she were preparing for a simple transition rather than an ending. She continued attending staff meetings, sitting quietly in the back now instead of at Douglas's side. She answered questions when asked but stopped volunteering information. She stopped catching the errors in Douglas's presentations before he made them in front of clients. She stopped reminding him of promises he had made and deadlines he had forgotten. The effect was subtle at first. A client meeting where Douglas fumbled a question about zoning variances. A proposal that went out with incorrect cost projections. A phone call from a longtime patron asking specifically for Marin and being redirected to Eleanor, who did not know the patron's history with the firm or the particular sensitivities of the project. Marin watched it all with the patience of someone who has learned that time reveals what confrontation obscures. Eleanor, meanwhile, was settling into her new role with the confidence of someone who did not know how much she did not know. She scheduled meetings with clients Marin had cultivated for decades and presented ideas that were fresh but untethered to history. She reorganized the filing systems in ways that made them more visually appealing but less functional. She attended industry events on Douglas's arm and laughed at his jokes with the particular attention of someone who had reasons beyond professional admiration. Marin noticed. She noticed the way Eleanor's hand lingered on Douglas's sleeve during conversations. She noticed the matching calendars, the overlapping travel schedules, the small gifts that appeared on Eleanor's desk without explanation. She noticed Douglas coming home later and later, smelling faintly of a perfume Marin did not own. She did not confront. She documented. Her personal attorney had connected her with a forensic accountant, a quiet man named Raymond who specialized in untangling complicated financial arrangements. He was methodical and dispassionate, treating the examination of her marriage dissolution as he would any other professional puzzle. The irregularities he found went beyond the forged signatures. There were expense accounts used for purposes that had nothing to do with client entertainment. There were consulting fees paid to a company that, upon investigation, consisted entirely of Eleanor's former roommate. There were transfers from the firm's operating accounts to personal investment vehicles that Marin had never seen. Raymond presented his findings without judgment. He simply laid out the numbers and let them speak for themselves. Marin thanked him and asked him to compile a complete report. Then she drove to her mother's house on the Maine coast and sat on the porch watching the ocean until the sun went down. Her mother, June, had always known. Not the specifics, not the forgeries or the financial manipulation. But she had watched her daughter slowly diminish over 30 years of marriage, and she had said nothing because June understood that some truths cannot be told. They must be discovered. She was 84 years old now, her hands gnarled with arthritis but her mind still sharp. She made tea and sat beside Marin on the porch swing, waiting for her daughter to speak. "I think my marriage is ending," Marin finally said. June nodded slowly. "I think it ended a long time ago. Why did you never say anything?" "Because you would not have heard it. You needed to see it yourself." They sat in silence as the waves crashed against the rocks below. The lighthouse on the adjacent property blinked its steady rhythm, guiding ships through waters that looked calm but hid dangerous currents. "Your grandfather built that lighthouse," June said. "Did you know that?" Marin had heard the story before, but she shook her head anyway. Some stories needed to be told more than once. He was hired to restore it after the Great Storm of 1923. Everyone said it was beyond saving. The foundation was cracked, the tower was leaning, the lens had shattered. But he saw what it could be. He spent 2 years bringing it back, and when he was finished, it was stronger than it had ever been before. The metaphor was not subtle, but it did not need to be. Marin leaned against her mother's shoulder the way she had when she was a child, when problems could be solved with patience and the right application of love. "What do I do now?" she asked. "You remember who you were before you started trying to fit beside him. And then you become her again." Marin stayed 3 days. She walked the property, visited the lighthouse, sat in her mother's kitchen reading books from her childhood. She did not check her email. She did not return Douglas's increasingly irritated phone calls about scheduling and client needs and the operations that were apparently falling apart without her invisible hand steadying them. On the morning of the 4th day, she drove back to the city with a decision made. She would not fight. She would not confront. She would simply leave, and she would take only what was rightfully hers. The rest could collapse under its own weight. Douglas did not notice her resolve. He noticed only that she was quieter than usual, more distant, less responsive to his requests. He attributed it to her mother's declining health, which he had heard about secondhand but not bothered to ask about directly. The months that followed established a new rhythm. Marin continued her work at the firm, but she worked differently now. She trained her replacement, not Eleanor, but the junior architects who had always come to her with questions. She organized her files with the thoroughness of someone preparing to hand over a legacy. She documented everything. She also began building something new. It started with a conference she attended in Boston, a gathering of preservation professionals that Douglas had deemed too small to bother with personally. She went as the firm's advisory representative, which meant she had no presentations to give and no clients to impress. She could simply listen. The keynote speaker was a man named Samuel Mercer. She knew the name, as everyone in preservation circles did. He had made a fortune in commercial development, then surprised the industry by pivoting to historic restoration projects. His company had saved a dozen significant structures that larger developers would have demolished without thought. What struck her was not his resume. It was the way he spoke. He credited his team. He asked questions instead of making pronouncements. He admitted failures and described what he had learned from them. He stood at the podium and spoke about buildings the way her grandfather had, as though they were living things deserving of respect. After the panel, she made her way to the reception with no particular intention. She was examining a display of before and after photographs when a voice beside her said, "You wrote the Harrington House study, did you not?" She turned to find Samuel Mercer looking at her with genuine interest. He was perhaps 10 years older than her, silver-haired, with the weathered complexion of someone who spent more time on job sites than in corner offices. She was startled. "That was 23 years ago. I have referenced it in 3 different projects." The methodology you developed for assessing structural compromise in Victorian-era foundations is still the most comprehensive framework I have found." Marin did not know what to say. No one had mentioned that study in years. Douglas had certainly never brought it up, despite having presented its findings at the conference where he first established his reputation. "I did not realize anyone still used it," she finally managed. Samuel smiled. "The people who do the actual work remember where the good work comes from." They talked for an hour. He asked her professional opinions and listened to the answers. He did not interrupt or redirect or steer the conversation back to himself. When she mentioned her current advisory role, his expression shifted slightly, but he said nothing judgmental. Instead, he handed her a card. "I am beginning a new project. A lighthouse restoration on the Maine coast. I could use a consultant who understands both the structural and historical challenges. If you are ever interested." Marin took the card and thanked him. She did not mention that she knew exactly which lighthouse he was talking about, or that she could see it from her mother's kitchen window. Some information needed to be protected until the right moment. She returned home to find Douglas in his study, on the phone with someone he quickly ended the call with when he saw her. His desk was covered with papers he gathered into a folder before she could see them. "How was the conference?" he asked, not quite meeting her eyes. "Educational," she said. That night, lying beside him in the darkness, she felt the full weight of 30 years pressing down on her chest. He was already asleep, or pretending to be. He had not asked about her mother. He had not asked about her work. He had not asked about anything that mattered. She turned onto her side and stared at the wall, counting the hours until she could leave. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of ordinary day that becomes a boundary line between before and after. Marin was in her office, reviewing a contract for a restoration project she would not be around to complete, when her phone rang with her mother's neighbor's number. June had fallen. "A stroke," the doctors said later. She was conscious but confused, asking for Marin, asking for her husband who had been dead for 20 years, asking for the lighthouse light to be turned on because the ships might get lost. Marin booked a flight for the next morning and packed a bag with the efficiency of someone who had been expecting this call for years. She left a note for Douglas on the kitchen counter, explaining the situation and providing the hospital information. He did not call her that night. He was at a client dinner, he texted. He would try to get away early. She flew to Maine alone. The hospital was a small regional facility with worn linoleum and staff who remembered June from her decades of volunteer work. They gave Marin a chair beside her mother's bed and brought her coffee without asking. June drifted in and out of consciousness. When she was awake, she held Marin's hand with surprising strength and spoke in fragments that sometimes made sense and sometimes did not. "The lighthouse," she said once. "He is out there trying to fix the lighthouse. Grandpa has been gone a long time, Mama." June's eyes focused with sudden clarity. "Not him. You. You are out there trying to fix something that was never broken. Stop fixing. Start leaving." Marin did not know if her mother meant the marriage or the lighthouse or something else entirely. It did not matter. The message was clear either way. Douglas did not come. He called twice, both times briefly. "There were meetings," he explained. "The Frankfurt delegation was in town, and Eleanor could not handle them alone. He would try to fly out soon." Marin checked his shared calendar. There was no Frankfurt delegation. The afternoon he claimed to be in meetings showed only a block-marked private consultation at a hotel restaurant she had never heard of. She did not confront him. There was no point anymore. June died on the third day, in the soft grey light of early morning. Marin was holding her hand when it happened. The machines beeped their steady rhythm, then their alarm, then their silence. A nurse came and checked pulses and made notations. A doctor was called to pronounce what everyone already knew. Marin signed the necessary paperwork with a steady hand. She collected her mother's personal effects, the wedding ring she had worn for 58 years, the Bible she had kept on her nightstand, the lavender lotion Marin had brought from home. She thanked the nurses for their kindness. Then she walked to the hospital cafeteria and bought a cup of coffee she did not drink. She sat at a table by the window and watched the parking lot fill with people arriving for visiting hours, families coming to see loved ones who were still alive, who still had time. Her phone buzzed. A text from Douglas. "Flight delayed. We'll try tomorrow." She checked the flight tracker. His flight was on time. It had not even been booked. Marin sat with that knowledge for a long time. Then she finished her cold coffee, threw away the cup, and drove to her mother's house to begin making arrangements. The funeral was small. June had outlived most of her friends, and the family had never been large. A few neighbors came, some former colleagues from her volunteer work, the minister who had known her for 40 years. Douglas arrived 3 hours after the service ended. He brought flowers that would have meant something if they had arrived in time. He offered condolences with the practiced sincerity of someone who had given many condolences and no longer felt the weight of them. "I am so sorry," he said, embracing her in the kitchen where she was washing dishes that did not need washing. "You know how it is. The business cannot run itself." Marin dried her hands. "I know exactly how it is." He did not hear the change in her voice. He never heard what he was not listening for. She asked him to stay, to help her sort through her mother's things. He had meetings, he said. Important ones. He would come back in a few weeks, when things had calmed down. He left that evening. Marin stood on the porch and watched his rental car disappear down the road that led to the airport. She did not wave. That night, she sat in her mother's study, in the chair where June had spent so many evenings reading and thinking and watching the lighthouse blink its patient rhythm. In the bottom drawer of the desk, she found an envelope with her name on it. Inside was a letter dated 3 years ago. "My darling Marin," her mother had written in her careful script. "If you are reading this, I have gone to join your father, and you are finally alone enough to hear what I could never tell you while I was there to soften the blow. You have spent 30 years trying to be small enough to fit beside a man who needed all the space in any room he entered. You have given your talent, your ideas, your family's legacy to someone who takes credit as naturally as breathing. You have watched yourself disappear and called it partnership. I am not writing this to be cruel. I am writing it because I love you, and because love means telling the truth even when it hurts. The lighthouse is yours. The land is yours. Your grandfather's legacy is yours. And more importantly, your own life is yours. Do not spend another day giving it to someone who does not see you. Come home when you are ready. The lighthouse will wait. So will your future. With all my love, Mama." Marin read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and walked outside to watch the lighthouse beam sweep across the dark water. Her mother had seen everything. Her mother had waited, patient as the tide, for Marin to see it too. In the morning, she called her attorney. The reading of the will was a formality. June had been explicit in her wishes. The house, the 40 acres of coastal land, the lighthouse and the property surrounding it, everything went to Marin. There was also a modest investment account and a collection of her grandfather's original architectural drawings that were worth more as historical artifacts than as financial assets. Douglas learned about the inheritance through a text message. He called that evening, his voice carrying an excitement that had nothing to do with her grief. "That is wonderful news," he said. "That property must be worth a fortune. We should talk to the developers who approached you about it last year." Marin was sitting on her mother's porch, watching the sun set over the water. The lighthouse light had just clicked on, beginning its nightly vigil. "I am not selling," she said. A pause. "Be reasonable, Marin. That land is just sitting there. Think of what we could do with that capital. The firm needs investment for expansion, and with the right developer, we could triple our portfolio by next year." "No." Another pause, longer this time. "I understand you are grieving. We can talk about this when you get back." "I am not selling," she repeated. "And I am not sure when I am coming back." She hung up before he could respond. Then she turned off her phone and went inside to make herself a cup of chamomile tea. The house was quiet in a way the city apartment never was. No traffic noise, no neighbors, no constant buzzing of electronic devices. Just the wind and the waves and the distant cry of seabirds settling for the night. Marin sat at her mother's kitchen table and began to plan. She stayed in Maine for 2 weeks. She told Douglas she was handling the estate, which was true. She told the firm she was taking personal leave, which they could not refuse. She did not explain further, and no one asked. The days fell into a rhythm. Mornings, she walked the property, reacquainting herself with the land her family had owned for generations. She inspected the lighthouse, noting the repairs it needed and the features that remained intact. She sat on the rocks and watched the tide move in and out, steady as breath. Afternoons, she worked. She spread her mother's records across the dining table and sorted through decades of correspondence, photographs, financial documents. She found her grandfather's original notes on the lighthouse restoration, detailed observations written in a precise hand that reminded her of her own. She found letters from preservationists across the country, thanking her grandmother for her advocacy work. She found a legacy that had nothing to do with Douglas Caldwell. Evenings, she read books from her childhood, novels her mother had loved, technical manuals on lighthouse restoration that she ordered online and read with growing interest. She made simple dinners and ate them alone, and the solitude felt like medicine. She also made phone calls. Her attorney confirmed that the divorce filing was ready whenever she wanted to proceed. Her forensic accountant completed his report documenting the financial irregularities in the firm. Her personal banker set up new accounts in her name only. Her financial advisor began restructuring her investments to separate them from joint holdings. Each call was a thread being cut. Each conversation brought her closer to freedom. On the 10th day, she called Samuel Mercer. He remembered her immediately, which surprised her and probably should not have. They spoke for nearly an hour about the lighthouse project, about preservation challenges, about the particular difficulties of working with 19th-century construction techniques. He listened to her ideas and asked intelligent questions and treated her as a colleague rather than an assistant. At the end of the conversation, he asked if she would like to visit the project site. She paused. The lighthouse he was restoring was less than a mile from where she was sitting. She could see it from her window. "I would," she said. "But I should tell you something first. The lighthouse adjacent to your project site belonged to my family. It is mine now." A moment of silence. Then Samuel laughed, a warm sound without mockery. "I knew there was a reason the Preservation Society recommended you specifically. Will you be keeping it? I am considering restoring it myself." "Then perhaps we should discuss a partnership," he said. "I could use your expertise, and you could use my resources. If you are interested." Marin looked out the window at the two lighthouses, hers and his, standing sentinel on the rocky coast. Both needed work. Both could be magnificent again. "I am interested," she said. "Very interested." She returned to the city on the 14th day. The apartment felt smaller than she remembered, cramped and dark despite its expensive renovations. Douglas's presence was everywhere, his awards on the shelves, his magazines on the coffee table, his cologne lingering in the bathroom, but he himself was absent. A meeting in Los Angeles, according to his calendar. He would be back by the weekend. Marin unpacked slowly. She did not put her things away properly because she knew she would be packing them again soon. She watered the plants that Douglas had neglected, threw away the expired food in the refrigerator, and sat in the living room watching the city lights blink on as evening fell. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Marin, I hope you do not mind that I found your personal contact. This is Patricia Langford. I heard about your mother's passing and wanted to offer my condolences. She was a remarkable woman, and you are very like her." Patricia Langford was 81 years old, the matriarch of a family that had worked with Caldwell and Associates for 2 decades. They owned several historic properties across New England and had been among the firm's first major clients. Marin had handled their accounts personally for years, attending family events, advising on restoration decisions, building the kind of relationship that transcended business. Douglas had taken credit for landing the Langford account at every opportunity. He had never mentioned that Patricia had specifically requested Marin after reading her Harrington House study. Marin replied with thanks for the condolences. She did not expect the phone call that came an hour later. "My dear," Patricia said in her patrician accent, "I hope this is not an imposition, but I wanted to speak with you directly. There are some concerns I have about the firm's direction, and frankly, I trust your judgment more than anyone else there." They spoke for 40 minutes. Patricia's concerns were specific and damning. Proposals that missed the mark. Communications that felt impersonal and uninformed. A sense that the firm was more interested in expansion than in the quality of work that had earned her loyalty in the first place. "I hired Caldwell and Associates because of you," Patricia said finally. "Your husband presented beautifully, but you understood what our family needed. You cared about the history, not just the project. That is increasingly rare." Marin closed her eyes. "I appreciate you telling me this. I am not telling you to flatter you. I am telling you because I need to know if things are going to improve, or if I should start looking elsewhere." The question hung between them. Marin could offer reassurances she did not believe. She could make promises she had no power to keep. She could protect the firm and her husband and the life she was planning to leave. Instead, she told the truth. "I do not think things are going to improve," she said quietly. "And I think you should protect your interests accordingly. Whatever that looks like." A long silence. Then Patricia said, "Thank you for your honesty. I know what that cost you." They hung up with promises to stay in touch. Marin sat in the darkness of her living room and felt something shift inside her, a final loosening of loyalty to a man who had never been loyal in return. The next morning, she went to the firm. She arrived early, before most of the staff, and made her way to her diminished office with a box of personal items she had left in Maine. The photographs were going home. The awards, what few had been given to her rather than claimed by Douglas, were going with her. The files she needed had already been copied. She was organizing her desk when Eleanor appeared in the doorway. "Marin, I heard about your mother. I am so sorry." The words were correct. The tone was not. Eleanor's eyes scanned the box, the empty shelves, the clear signs of someone preparing to leave. "Thank you," Marin said. "I appreciate it." Eleanor lingered. "We missed you at the Preservation Society Gala. Douglas gave a wonderful speech." "I heard. He talked about the firm's future. Some really exciting directions." She paused, waiting for Marin to ask for details. Marin did not ask. She continued organizing her desk with methodical precision, placing items in the box with care. "Well," Eleanor said finally, "let me know if you need anything." She left, and Marin allowed herself a small smile. The scrambling had begun. Eleanor knew something was different, even if she could not name it. The invisible woman was becoming visible in all the wrong ways. Douglas returned from Los Angeles that Friday. He brought gifts, a scarf from a boutique Marin had never heard of, a bottle of wine she did not drink, a promise to take her to dinner that she knew would be broken. "How are you holding up?" he asked, not quite meeting her eyes. "I am managing. The estate stuff must be overwhelming. Do you need help finding a realtor for the property? I told you, I am not selling." He frowned. "Marin, be practical. That land is too valuable to let it sit there collecting seaweed. And you will not want to deal with the upkeep from here." She looked at him carefully, really looked, in a way she had not in years. He was still handsome, still polished, still carrying himself with the confidence of a man who had always gotten what he wanted. But there were cracks now. Tiredness around his eyes. Tension in his jaw. The slight strain of a man whose foundation was less solid than he pretended. "I am not selling," she said again. "And I will be spending more time there going forward." "What does that mean?" "It means I have made some decisions about my future." He stared at her as though seeing someone he did not recognize. Then his phone buzzed, and he glanced at it, and whatever he had been about to say disappeared into the distraction. "We will talk about this later," he said, already moving toward his study. "I have a call." Marin watched him go. She felt nothing. The weeks that followed established a new normal. Marin continued her quiet audit of the firm's finances, documenting everything. She met with her attorney to finalize the divorce papers, reviewing each provision with the thoroughness she brought to every project. She began consulting remotely on Samuel's lighthouse restoration, spending hours on video calls discussing structural assessments and historical research. She also stopped doing the things that had held the firm together. It was not sabotage. She did not actively undermine anything. She simply withdrew the invisible labor that Douglas had never acknowledged and therefore never valued. She stopped reminding him about client preferences before meetings. She stopped reviewing his presentations for errors. She stopped managing the interpersonal conflicts among junior staff. She stopped being the institutional memory that allowed the firm to function smoothly. The effects were gradual but cumulative. A proposal went out with a significant mathematical error that would have cost the firm money if the client had not caught it first. A long-time vendor called to complain about invoices that had not been paid. A meeting was scheduled for a time when the key participants were already committed elsewhere. Eleanor, tasked with the responsibilities Marin had quietly carried for decades, struggled to keep up. She was intelligent and capable, but she lacked the relationships, the institutional knowledge, the understanding of how everything connected to everything else. Douglas blamed her when things went wrong, which was often now. Their arguments carried through the office walls, Eleanor's defensive justifications and Douglas's rising frustration. The staff pretended not to hear. Marin heard everything. She documented what was relevant. She felt a grim satisfaction that she was not proud of but did not deny. One evening, she was working late, finishing the transfer of her files to personal storage, when Douglas appeared in her doorway. "We need to talk," he said. She saved her work and turned to face him. "All right." He came in and closed the door behind him. His face was strained, older than it had been even a month ago. "Things are falling apart," he said. "Clients are unhappy. Staff are leaving. Eleanor is overwhelmed. I am sorry to hear that." He stared at her. "Are you? Because it feels like you have been watching it happen." Marin considered her response carefully. She could deny it. She could offer explanations. She could do what she had always done, smooth things over, solve problems, make him feel better about his own shortcomings. Instead, she asked a question. "When was the last time you asked me for my professional opinion?" Douglas blinked. "What? My opinion? On a client matter? On a business decision? On anything related to the work we supposedly do together? When did you last ask what I thought?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. The silence stretched. "I do not remember," he finally admitted. "No," Marin said. "You do not. Because you stopped asking years ago. You stopped thinking of me as a partner and started thinking of me as support staff. And now you are surprised that when I stop supporting, things stop working. That is not fair. Is it not?" She stood, gathering her bag. "You demoted me in front of the entire staff. You replaced me with someone half my age who you are also sleeping with. You forged my signature to steal my ownership stake in the company I helped build with my family's money. And you think I am being unfair?" The color drained from his face. "What are you talking about?" "The amendments to the ownership structure. The ones dated 2020, 2021, and 2022. She kept her voice steady. "I never signed those documents, Douglas. And you know it." He tried to speak, to explain, to spin. But for the first time in 30 years, Marin did not wait to hear it. "My attorney will be in touch," she said. Then she walked out of the office, out of the building, and did not look back. The divorce papers arrived at Douglas's office on a Tuesday morning, precisely as Marin's attorney had planned. She was not there to see his reaction. She was in Maine, walking the property that had always been meant to be her home. The lighthouse stood steady against the grey sky, its lamp dark in the daylight but ready to shine when needed. Her phone rang repeatedly throughout the day. Douglas, then his attorney, then Douglas again. She let each call go to voicemail. There was nothing he could say that would change anything, and she had no interest in hearing him try. By late afternoon, the calls had slowed. She made herself tea and sat on the porch, wrapped in her mother's old sweater, watching the waves roll in. Her phone buzzed with a text from Samuel. "I am in the area reviewing the project. Would you like company for dinner?" She typed back a single word. "Yes." He arrived at 7 with a bottle of wine she would actually drink and a quiet presence that asked for nothing. They ate a simple meal she had prepared and talked about architecture, about history, about the challenges of restoring something beautiful that the world had forgotten. He did not ask about the divorce. He did not need to. He simply treated her as a colleague, as an equal, as someone whose opinions mattered. After dinner, they walked along the cliffs in the fading light. The two lighthouses stood sentinel against the darkening sky, hers and his, separated by less than a mile of rocky coastline. "I think they were built by the same architect," Samuel said, looking from one to the other. "The proportions are identical." Marin nodded. "My grandfather thought so too. He researched it for years but could never find definitive proof. Perhaps you will find it. You have access to records he never did." She looked at him in the twilight. He was not handsome in the way Douglas was handsome, not polished or practiced. But he was present. Attentive. Real. "Perhaps I will," she said. They parted with a handshake that lingered just a moment longer than professional necessity required. She watched his car disappear down the coastal road, then went inside to read her mother's letter one more time. The next morning, she signed the divorce papers at a small notary's office in the nearest town. No witnesses except the notary and her attorney, who had driven up from the city for the occasion. "Is there anything you want to add?" the attorney asked as she reviewed the final page. "Any closing statement?" Marin thought of 30 years. The projects, the sacrifices, the slow erosion of her own identity. The forgeries and the betrayals and the countless small cruelties of being unseen by someone who was supposed to see her. "No," she said. "The documents speak for themselves." She signed her name with a steady hand. The notary stamped and sealed. It was done. She walked out into the afternoon sunshine and breathed deeply, the salt air filling her lungs. Behind her was everything she had been. Before her was everything she could become. Her phone buzzed with a message from Samuel. "Celebration is in order. There is a restaurant in Portland with an excellent wine list and a view of the harbor. May I take you to lunch?" She typed back before she could overthink it. "I would like that." 3 hours later, she was seated across from him at a rooftop restaurant, laughing at something he had said about a contractor who had tried to replace historic bricks with modern reproductions. The wine was good. The food was excellent. The company was better than she had experienced in years. She had not laughed like this in longer than she could remember. Real laughter, unguarded and full, the kind that comes from genuine delight rather than social obligation. Samuel was telling another story when his expression shifted. He was looking over her shoulder at something near the entrance. Marin turned. Douglas stood at the host stand, Eleanor beside him in a dress too formal for a weekday lunch. He was scanning the restaurant with the irritation of a man whose reservation was not being honored quickly enough. His eyes found Marin. His face went through confusion, recognition, and something else. Something that might have been pain if he were capable of feeling it for anyone other than himself. She turned back to Samuel. Her wine glass was still in her hand. Her smile did not falter. "Someone you know?" Samuel asked quietly. "My ex-husband," she said. "The papers were signed this morning." She did not look back. She did not need to see Douglas's face to know what was happening inside him. For the first time in 30 years, he was seeing her from the outside. He was seeing what she looked like when she was no longer trying to fit beside him. He was seeing the woman he had dismissed, diminished, and discarded, sitting in the light with someone who saw her clearly. And there was nothing he could do about it. The lunch continued. Samuel told more stories. Marin laughed when things were funny and asked questions when things were interesting and did not perform for anyone watching. She knew Douglas was still there. She could feel his attention like a weight on her back. But she was done carrying weights that were not hers. 2 hours later, she and Samuel walked out of the restaurant together. Douglas and Eleanor had left at some point, she was not sure when. It did not matter. Outside, the afternoon sun was warm on her face. Samuel walked her to her car and thanked her for the company. "I hope this becomes a regular occurrence," he said. "So do I." She drove back to the coast with the windows down, letting the salt air whip through her hair. The lighthouse was waiting when she arrived, its lamp already beginning to glow in the gathering dusk. That night, she sat on the porch with her mother's letter in her lap and watched the light sweep across the water. "I came home," she whispered to the darkness. "Just like you said." The lighthouse blinked its steady rhythm, patient as always. The waves crashed against the rocks below. And Marin Caldwell, for the first time in 30 years, felt like herself. But this story is not finished. Because while Marin was finding her peace, Douglas was losing his. And the distance between those two journeys was about to collapse in ways neither of them expected. What happens when a man who built his entire identity on being admired is forced to watch the woman he dismissed become everything he claimed to be? What happens when the truth comes out, not in a confrontation, but in the quiet accumulation of consequence? And what happens when Marin must choose between the revenge she has earned and the peace she has finally found? The answers are coming. But for now, the lighthouse keeps its watch, the waves keep their rhythm, and somewhere in a city far from here, a man who took everything for granted is beginning to understand what he lost. Some lessons can only be learned too late. Douglas Caldwell did not sleep that night. He lay in the bed he had shared with Marin for 23 years and stared at the ceiling, replaying the restaurant scene until every detail was burned into his memory. The way she had laughed. The ease of her posture. The complete absence of performance in her smile. He had watched her for 30 years. He knew every version of her public face, the gracious hostess, the supportive wife, the competent professional who made him look better without ever demanding credit. He knew how she laughed at client dinners and how she smiled for photographs and how she carried herself when she knew she was being observed. What he had seen in that restaurant was none of those things. She had not noticed him at first. That was the part that haunted him most. For a full minute, perhaps longer, she had been completely unaware of his presence. And in that minute, he had seen something he did not recognize. She looked happy. Not the measured contentment she had shown him for years. Not the patient acceptance he had mistaken for satisfaction. Real happiness, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and does not require an audience. He had never made her look like that. The realization settled into his chest like a stone, heavy and cold and impossible to ignore. Eleanor stirred beside him. She had been quiet since they left the restaurant, her usual chatter subdued. She had seen it too. Everyone in that room had seen it. "Douglas," she murmured. "Are you awake?" He did not answer. He was not ready to perform reassurance. He was not sure he could. The morning brought no clarity. He went to the office early, before the staff arrived, and sat in the conference room where he had announced Marin's demotion. The chairs were arranged exactly as they had been that day. Her seat was empty, as it had been for weeks now. He had not noticed her absence. That was the thing. He had restructured her role, given away her responsibilities, diminished her title, and then he had stopped noticing whether she was there at all. How long had she been preparing to leave? How long had she watched him with those careful eyes, documenting his failures while he remained oblivious? The divorce papers were on his desk, delivered by courier the previous morning. He had not signed them yet. His attorney advised negotiation, delay, strategic maneuvering. But the attached exhibit, the forensic accountant's report, changed everything. She knew about the signatures. She had proof. Douglas had not forged them himself. His attorney had handled the paperwork, had assured him that the restructuring was routine, that Marin would never notice or care. She was not interested in business matters, the attorney had said. She would not think to check. He had believed it because he wanted to. Because it was easier than acknowledging what he was doing. Now the evidence was laid out in clinical detail. Dates, notarizations, comparison signatures. The report did not use the word forgery, but it did not need to. The implication was clear. If she went public, his reputation would be destroyed. If she filed criminal charges, his freedom would be at risk. If she simply shared the report with the right people, everything he had built would collapse. And she was not asking for anything. That was the part he could not understand. The divorce terms were almost modest. Her original investment in the firm. The properties that had belonged to her family. Her freedom. She was not trying to take everything. She was just trying to leave. He picked up his phone and dialed her number for the 14th time. It rang once and went to voicemail. "Marin," he said into the silence. "We need to talk. Please." He did not know what else to say. He hung up and waited for a response that did not come. In Maine, Marin was walking the lighthouse grounds with a notebook in her hand. The structure needed more work than she had initially estimated. The exterior stonework was sound, but the interior stairs were rotting, the lamp mechanism was corroded, and decades of deferred maintenance had taken their toll. It would cost more than she had planned to spend. It would take longer than she had hoped. She did not care. For the first time in 30 years, she was building something that belonged entirely to her. Every decision was hers to make. Every problem was hers to solve. Every success would be hers to claim. The freedom of it was almost overwhelming. Samuel had sent over his project manager to assess the structural needs, a quiet woman named Helen who had been restoring historic buildings for longer than Marin had been married. They walked the property together, discussing load-bearing walls and period-appropriate materials and the particular challenges of coastal construction. "This is good bones," Helen said finally, running her hand along the original doorframe. "Someone loved this building once. You can always tell. My grandfather restored it in 1923, Marin said. "After the Great Storm." Helen nodded. "That explains the reinforced foundation." He knew what he was doing. She paused, looking at Marin with professional assessment. "What are you planning to do with it?" Marin had been thinking about this since her mother's funeral. The answer had come slowly, emerging from the silence like a photograph developing in solution. "A retreat," she said. "For people who need quiet to do their work. Writers, artists, anyone who needs space away from noise." Helen considered this. The location is perfect for that. No distractions. Nothing but sky and sea. That is the idea. They discussed timelines and budgets and the permits that would be required. Helen promised to send a detailed proposal by the end of the week. She drove away in her practical truck, leaving Marin alone with her lighthouse and her plans. That evening, Samuel called. "I hear you are planning something ambitious," he said. Helen was impressed. Marin smiled into the phone. "Did she tell you about the rotting stairs?" "She mentioned them. She also mentioned that you knew exactly what you wanted. That is rarer than you might think. I have had a lot of time to figure it out." A pause. "Douglas has been calling my office. Apparently he found out I was at that lunch." Marin sighed. "What did he want?" "He wanted to know how long we had been seeing each other." His tone implied something inappropriate. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him the truth. That we are colleagues working on a restoration project. That our relationship is professional and respectful. That what happened in his marriage is not my concern or my responsibility." Marin closed her eyes. "Thank you. You do not need to thank me for telling the truth, Marin. You need to stop expecting people to do otherwise." She did not know what to say to that. So she said nothing, and the silence between them was comfortable. "I will be in the area this weekend," Samuel continued. "There are some decisions I need to make on site. Would you like to have dinner?" "I would like that very much." They hung up, and Marin sat on her mother's porch watching the darkness gather. The lighthouse lamp clicked on, beginning its nightly sweep across the water. She was building a new life. Slowly, carefully, with attention to the foundations. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not afraid of what might come next. Douglas's desperation grew in direct proportion to his diminishing control. He called Marin's attorney and was told that all communication should go through proper legal channels. He called her personal phone and reached voicemail every time. He sent emails that went unanswered. He even called her old colleagues, the ones he had never bothered to cultivate, hoping someone might have a way to reach her. No one did. Or if they did, they were not sharing it with him. The firm, meanwhile, continued its slow unraveling. Patricia Langford formally notified them that she was moving her accounts to another preservation firm. Her letter was polite but clear. The quality of service had declined. The personal attention that had characterized their relationship was no longer present. She wished them well but could not in good conscience continue the partnership. Other clients followed. Some left quietly, their accounts simply not renewing. Others were more explicit in their reasons. A developer in Boston mentioned that his calls were not being returned. A museum board in Philadelphia complained about missed deadlines and incomplete documentation. The problems were not catastrophic individually, but together, they painted a picture that Douglas could not deny. Marin had been the foundation. He had been the facade. Eleanor tried to fill the gaps, but she was overwhelmed by responsibilities she had never been prepared for. She worked late nights and early mornings, grew short-tempered with staff, made mistakes that cascaded into larger problems. The confident young partner who had laughed at Douglas's jokes and touched his arm in meetings was being replaced by someone anxious and defensive. Their relationship, such as it was, began to fray. "You need to fix this," Eleanor said one evening, standing in his office doorway. "The Hartwell proposal is a disaster. The client is threatening to walk. I am working on it. You have been working on it for 3 weeks." She stepped closer, and her voice dropped. "People are talking, Douglas. They are saying the firm was never really yours. That Marin was the one who made it work. That is not true. Then prove it. Because right now, everything is falling apart, and I am the one being blamed." She left without waiting for a response. Douglas sat in the gathering darkness and listened to the building empty around him. He had spent 30 years convinced that his talent was the foundation of everything they had built. Now he was watching that foundation crumble, and he could no longer pretend it had ever been solid. In Maine, the restoration moved forward. Marin had established a routine. Mornings were for planning, afternoons for the physical work of clearing and assessing, evenings for research and correspondence. She hired a local contractor who came recommended by Helen, a man named Thomas who had restored half the historic buildings on the coast and understood the particular demands of lighthouse construction. He arrived each day at 7 with coffee and a quiet competence that Marin found reassuring. He did not ask about her past or her marriage or why a woman her age was suddenly living alone on a remote coastal property. He asked about materials and measurements and whether she wanted the original fixtures restored or replaced. She chose restoration every time. The work was slow and often frustrating. Permits took longer than expected. Materials were hard to source. The weather turned uncooperative for a stretch of 2 weeks, making exterior work impossible. But there was satisfaction in the difficulty, in the solving of problems that had concrete solutions. One afternoon, she was in the lighthouse keeper's cottage, stripping layers of paint from the original woodwork, when her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. "Mrs. Caldwell," the voice said. "This is Patricia Langford. I hope I am not interrupting." Marin set down her brush. "Mrs. Langford. It is good to hear from you. Patricia, please. I have been meaning to call since our last conversation. I wanted you to know that I have taken your advice. You moved your accounts. I did. And I wanted to thank you for your honesty. I know that was not easy, given your circumstances." Marin looked around the cottage, at the exposed beams and dusty windows and the slowly emerging beauty beneath decades of neglect. "My circumstances have changed," she said. "So I have heard. A lighthouse retreat, is it? Word travels quickly." Patricia laughed. "In our circles, yes. I think it sounds wonderful. The world needs more places where people can think without interruption." She paused. "I also wanted to offer something. A donation, if you will accept it. For the restoration." Marin was silent for a moment. "That is very generous." "It is not generosity. It is investment. In you, and in what you are building. You gave my family 30 years of excellent counsel. Let me give something back." They discussed the details. The amount was significant, enough to cover the remaining structural work and much of the interior renovation. Patricia asked for nothing in return except the occasional update on progress. After they hung up, Marin sat in the dusty cottage and cried. Not from sadness. From something else entirely. The accumulation of years, the weight of unrecognized work, the slowly dawning realization that she had been seen all along. Not by Douglas. Never by Douglas. But by the people who mattered. The third month brought new developments. Douglas finally signed the divorce papers, after his attorney made clear that contesting them would only expose the forgery evidence to public scrutiny. The terms were finalized without negotiation. Marin received her original investment, the family properties, and her freedom. She received the notification by email on a Wednesday afternoon. She read it once, then closed her laptop and walked to the lighthouse. The lamp mechanism had been fully restored the week before, its brass fittings gleaming in the afternoon light. That night, for the first time in decades, the lighthouse would shine again. She stood in the lantern room and looked out at the ocean. The water was grey under a cloudy sky, but she could see for miles in every direction. To the south, Samuel's lighthouse project was nearing completion. To the north, the coastline stretched into wilderness. It was over. 30 years of marriage, dissolved into paperwork and signatures. She waited to feel something. Grief, perhaps. Relief, certainly. The loss of what might have been, had things been different. What she felt instead was stillness. The same stillness she had felt on her mother's porch, the night she decided to leave. She was not angry anymore. She had passed through anger somewhere in the long months of preparation, and now she was simply here. Present. Ready for what came next. That evening, Samuel arrived for dinner. He brought wine and fresh fish from the local market and a quiet presence that asked for nothing. "I heard the news," he said as they prepared the meal together. "The divorce is final." Marin nodded. "Signed and sealed. How do you feel?" She considered the question. "I feel like myself," she said finally. "For the first time in a very long time." He looked at her with something like recognition. That is the best feeling there is. They ate on the porch as the sun set. The wine was good. The fish was excellent. The conversation moved easily from work to history to the particular challenges of building things that were meant to last. After dinner, they walked to the lighthouse together. Marin climbed the restored stairs with Samuel behind her, both of them slightly breathless by the time they reached the lantern room. The lamp was ready. Thomas had tested it earlier in the day, but this would be the first official lighting. "Do you want to do the honors?" Samuel asked. Marin looked at the mechanism, at the brass fittings her grandfather had restored a century ago, at the lens that would soon send light across miles of dark water. "Yes," she said. "I think I do." She pressed the switch. The lamp clicked on, its beam sweeping across the lantern room before continuing out into the gathering darkness. From below, she could hear Thomas and his crew cheering. The sound carried up through the tower, mixing with the crash of waves and the cry of seabirds. Samuel stood beside her, watching the light sweep across the water. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said. Marin's eyes were wet, but she was smiling. "I think he would." They stood in silence as the lighthouse did what lighthouses were meant to do. Somewhere out in the darkness, ships were finding their way. And here in the light, Marin was finding hers. Douglas learned about the lighthouse from an industry newsletter. He was at his desk, sorting through the wreckage of another failed proposal, when the article appeared in his inbox. Historic preservation pioneer leads lighthouse restoration on Maine coast. The photograph showed Marin standing in front of the restored tower, the lamp visible through the lantern room windows behind her. She was smiling, not the careful public smile he had seen for 30 years, but something warmer and more genuine. The article mentioned her family's legacy in preservation work. It mentioned her grandfather's original restoration of the lighthouse in the 1920s. It mentioned her expertise in structural assessment and historical research. It did not mention Douglas at all. He read the article 3 times, each reading revealing new details he had not noticed before. The retreat she was planning. The partnership with Samuel Mercer's foundation. The donations that were already coming in from supporters across the industry. She was not just surviving. She was thriving. And she was doing it without him. He left the office early that day, something he never did. He drove to their apartment, which felt empty and unfamiliar despite the familiar furniture. Marin's absence was everywhere, in the missing books, the bare spaces on walls where her photographs had hung, the closet that now held only his clothes. He poured himself a drink and sat in the living room as darkness fell. The city lights blinked on outside the window, thousands of lives continuing without any awareness of his private collapse. He had spent 30 years building an identity. The visionary architect. The successful businessman. The charismatic leader who inspired confidence and closed deals. Now that identity was crumbling, and he was not sure what would be left when it was gone. His phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Where are you? The client dinner is in an hour." He looked at the message for a long moment. Then he typed a response. "Handle it without me." He turned off his phone and sat in the darkness, drinking and thinking and trying to remember the man he had been before he became the man he had pretended to be. Spring came slowly to the Maine coast. The restoration was nearly complete. The lighthouse keeper's cottage had been transformed into a comfortable residence with modern amenities hidden behind period-appropriate facades. The grounds had been landscaped with native plants that would survive the salt spray and coastal winds. A small guest house had been built for visitors, with simple rooms that offered views of the ocean and nothing else. Marin had moved in permanently 2 months after the divorce was finalized. She sold her share of the city apartment without negotiation, accepting Douglas's offer without counteroffer or complaint. The money went into the restoration fund, covering the final details that transformed a construction project into a home. She established a rhythm. Mornings, she walked the property and reviewed the day's work. Afternoons, she met with potential retreat guests or consulted on other restoration projects. Evenings, she read or cooked or sat on the porch watching the lighthouse sweep its beam across the water. Samuel visited most weekends. Their relationship had evolved slowly, with the patience of people who had learned not to rush important things. He did not push. He did not make demands. He simply showed up, weekend after weekend, bringing wine and conversation and a presence that felt like home. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, he asked the question she had been expecting for months. "What do you want this to be, Marin?" She looked at him in the golden light. He was not handsome in any conventional way, but there was a steadiness to his features that she had come to find beautiful. "I want it to be real," she said. "Whatever that means." He nodded slowly. "Real is good. Real is what I want too. Then that is what we will build." He reached over and took her hand. His grip was warm and firm, and she did not pull away. They sat like that as the sun disappeared and the stars came out, two people who had lived long enough to know that some things could not be rushed. The lighthouse beam swept overhead, steady and patient, guiding ships through darkness they could not see beyond. The first guests arrived in June. They were writers, 3 of them, seeking quiet space to finish projects that had stalled in the noise of their regular lives. Marin showed them to their rooms, explained the meals and the schedules and the unwritten rules of the retreat. "No obligations," she said. "No requirements. Just space and time and silence." They stayed for 2 weeks. 2 of them finished their books. The third made enough progress to know the ending was within reach. When they left, one of them pressed a handwritten note into Marin's hand. She read it that evening, sitting in the lantern room as the lamp swept its beam across the water. "I came here broken," the note said. "The world had been too loud for too long, and I had forgotten how to hear my own voice. You gave me silence, and in that silence, I found myself again. Thank you for building a place where people can become who they were meant to be." Marin folded the note carefully and placed it in the drawer of her grandfather's desk, alongside her mother's letter and the handful of other words that had shaped her journey. She was building something that mattered. And for the first time in 30 years, she knew it was enough. Douglas's final attempt at contact came in August. A letter arrived at the lighthouse, handwritten on paper from the stationery he had used for decades. Marin recognized the handwriting immediately, the confident strokes that had once signed contracts and birthday cards and the margins of manuscripts they had reviewed together. She did not open it immediately. She set it on her desk and walked to the lantern room, watching the ocean churn beneath a grey sky. The storm that had been threatening for days was finally arriving. The lighthouse beam would be needed tonight. She returned to the cottage and made herself tea. Then she sat at her desk and opened the envelope. "Marin," the letter began. "I have started this letter many times and never known how to continue. There is so much I should say and no words that seem adequate." She read slowly, carefully, giving each sentence the attention it demanded. He wrote about the early years. The Victorian they had saved together. The nights they had spent reading manuscripts and dreaming of the firm they would build. The way she had believed in his vision when no one else did. He wrote about the middle years. The gradual drift that he had not noticed until it was too late. The decisions he had made without consulting her. The credit he had taken without acknowledgement. He wrote about the end. The restructuring he had orchestrated. The forgeries he had allowed. The affair he had conducted with the arrogance of a man who believed he could not be caught. "I am not writing to ask for forgiveness," he concluded. "I am not sure I deserve it, and I am not sure it matters anymore. I am writing because I finally understand what I lost. Not the firm. Not the reputation. You. I never saw you, Marin. Not really. I saw what you did for me, what you gave me, what you sacrificed. But I never saw you as a person separate from my needs. That is my failure. And I will carry it for the rest of my life. I hope you are happy. I hope the lighthouse gives you everything I never could. I hope you find someone who sees you clearly, who values you properly, who loves you the way you deserve to be loved. I am sorry. For everything. Douglas." Marin read the letter twice. Then she folded it and placed it in the drawer with the others. She did not cry. She did not feel the surge of vindication she might have expected. She felt only a quiet sadness for what might have been, for the man Douglas could have become if he had made different choices. She took out a blank sheet of paper and considered writing a response. There were things she could say. Acknowledgements she could offer. Doors she could close or leave ajar. Instead, she put the paper away. Some conversations did not need answers. Some endings did not need closure. Some letters were better left in drawers, read once and remembered, but never responded to. She made her tea and watched the storm roll in, lightning flickering over the dark water. The lighthouse beam swept steadily through the rain, patient and constant, doing the work it was built to do. The following spring brought recognition Marin had never sought. The Regional Preservation Society announced that she would receive their Lifetime Achievement Award, honoring 4 decades of contributions to historic preservation. The ceremony would be held in Boston, at a restored concert hall she had helped save 15 years earlier. Samuel was the first to hear about it. He called as soon as the announcement was made public. "Congratulations," he said. "Though I suspect you already knew this was coming." "I had no idea." "Then you are the only person in the industry who did not. Everyone I spoke to said you were long overdue." Marin looked out her window at the lighthouse, its lamp dark in the afternoon sun. "I never did this for recognition." "I know. That is why you deserve it." She attended the ceremony in May, wearing a simple navy dress that her mother would have approved of. Samuel accompanied her, distinguished in a dark suit, his hand warm on the small of her back as they navigated the crowd. The hall was filled with colleagues and clients and competitors, people who had watched her career from various distances. Some she recognized immediately. Others required introduction. Patricia Langford was there, seated in the front row with her family. She caught Marin's eye and nodded with a small smile. The presenter was a young architect named Maya, who had interned at Caldwell & Associates years ago and now ran her own successful firm. Her introduction was longer than Marin expected. "When I was 22 years old," Maya said, "I was assigned to work with Marin Caldwell on the Hartwell Historic District project. I expected to learn about preservation techniques and zoning regulations. What I learned instead was how to see. Marin taught me that buildings have stories. That every crack in the plaster and every worn step and every faded paint color is evidence of lives lived and choices made. She taught me that our job is not just to preserve structures, but to preserve the humanity embedded in them. She also taught me something else. Something that took me years to fully understand. She taught me that the people who do the most important work are often the least visible. That real expertise does not need to announce itself. That the best leaders are the ones who make everyone around them better without taking credit for the improvement. Marin Caldwell has spent her career building things that last. Not just buildings, but people. I am one of them. And I know I am not the only one." The applause was warm and sustained. Marin rose and walked to the podium, her legs steadier than she had expected. She looked out at the assembled crowd. At colleagues who had sought her advice for decades. At clients who had trusted her judgment. At young architects who would carry her principles into the future. And somewhere in the back, a face she recognized but had not expected. Douglas stood near the exit, alone, his presence unannounced. He was thinner than she remembered, older, diminished in ways that had nothing to do with age. He was not trying to be seen. He was simply there, watching the woman he had dismissed receive the recognition he had always sought for himself. Marin held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned to address the crowd. "I never needed this," she said. Her voice was steady, clear, carrying to the back of the hall. "I did this work because it mattered to me. Because buildings deserve protection. Because history is too easily erased when no one fights for it. But I hope the young architects in this room learn something from my path. Do the work because it matters, not because it is seen. Build relationships because they have value, not because they are useful. Give credit where it is due, especially when no one is watching. And if you find yourself being diminished, if you find yourself being made small to fit beside someone else's ambition, remember that you are allowed to leave. You are allowed to rebuild somewhere the noise cannot reach you. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is the most powerful thing you can offer yourself." She stepped back from the podium. The applause was louder this time, mixed with something that felt like recognition. She did not look toward Douglas again. She did not need to. The summer that followed was the fullest of Marin's life. The retreat was thriving. Word had spread through networks she had not even known she possessed, and applications arrived weekly from writers, artists, and scholars seeking the particular quiet that the lighthouse offered. She accepted 12 guests that season, staggering their stays to preserve the solitude that made the place special. Most came alone. A few brought partners who understood the value of separate space. All of them left changed. Samuel spent most weekends at the lighthouse now. His project was complete, the adjacent property restored and operating as an event space for preservation-focused gatherings. He had started talking about his next project, a series of historic structures on the Vermont border that needed rescue. He asked if she would consult. She said yes. Their relationship had deepened without declaration. They did not discuss labels or futures or the traditional markers of romantic progression. They simply existed in each other's lives, weekends becoming weeks, visits becoming stays, presents becoming partnership. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, he asked the question she had been waiting for. Would you consider making this permanent? She looked at him. His face was weathered and kind, marked by years of outdoor work and genuine smiles. He was nothing like Douglas. He never would be. What does permanent mean to you? She asked. He thought for a moment. It means I am here when you want me here. It means I give you space when you need space. It means we build things together without trying to own each other. He paused. It means I see you, Marin. The whole you. And I do not want to look away. She reached for his hand. Their fingers intertwined naturally, without hesitation. Then stay, she said. He did. Douglas's decline completed itself quietly. The firm closed in November, 16 months after Marin signed the divorce papers. The announcement was brief, citing market conditions and strategic restructuring. Industry observers knew the truth. Everyone knew the truth. Eleanor left before the final closure, accepting a position at a larger firm in another city. Their relationship ended without drama or public acknowledgement. She simply stopped appearing in his calendar, and he did not pursue her. Douglas sold the city apartment and bought a smaller place outside Boston. He took consulting work when it was offered, which was less and less frequently. He attended industry events as a guest rather than a keynote speaker, watching from the edges of rooms he had once dominated. He did not contact Marin again. The letter had been his final word. But he heard about her. Everyone in the industry heard about her now. The retreat that was changing lives. The consultancy that was saving buildings. The quiet empire she was building on the foundation he had never valued. He watched her success from a distance, and he felt something he had not expected. Not bitterness. Not jealousy. Something closer to relief. She had become who she was meant to be. And even if he had failed her in every way that mattered, at least he had failed her in a way that set her free. 5 years after the divorce, a journalist called. She was writing a profile of Marin for a major preservation magazine, and she wanted to understand the early years. The partnership with Douglas. The firm they had built. The work they had done before their paths diverged. Marin agreed to the interview. They spoke for 2 hours, walking the lighthouse grounds as the autumn leaves fell. The journalist asked about Douglas. About the collaboration. About what had happened to end it. Marin chose her words carefully. We built something important together, she said. And then we grew in different directions. That is the simple version. And the complicated version. She looked out at the ocean, grey under an overcast sky. The complicated version is that I spent 30 years trying to be seen by someone who never learned to look. And when I finally stopped trying, I discovered that I had been visible all along. Just not to him. The journalist wrote it down. Then she asked one final question. What would you say to him now, if you had the chance? Marin considered the question for a long moment. The wind off the water was cold but not unpleasant. In the distance, Samuel's restored lighthouse stood sentinel against the grey sky. I would not say anything, she finally answered. Some things do not need words. Some lessons can only be learned by living them. And has he learned? Marin smiled, a small and private expression. That is not my question to answer anymore. The article ran 3 months later. It was titled The Quiet Preservationist, and it traced Marin's career from her grandfather's teachings through the founding of the retreat that now bore his name. Douglas read it the day it was published. He read every word, every quote, every photograph caption. There was no bitterness in the article. No blame. No settling of scores. There was only the story of a woman who had found her way home. He set down the magazine and looked around his apartment. It was small, functional, adequate for a life that had grown small and functional. He had spent 63 years building a reputation. Now that reputation was gone, and he was left with only himself. It was not enough. But it would have to be. The final scene is not about Douglas. It is about Marin, standing in the lantern room of her lighthouse on a clear winter night. The stars are brilliant overhead, undimmed by city lights. The ocean stretches to the horizon, dark and endless and alive with its own ancient rhythms. Samuel is downstairs, reading by the fire. They have settled into a life together that requires no announcement, no performance, no external validation. They are simply two people who chose each other, quietly and completely. The retreat is closed for the winter. The last guests left a week ago, departing with hugs and promises to return. Their rooms have been cleaned, their beds made fresh, waiting for spring and the new souls who will need what this place offers. Marin looks out at the beam of light sweeping across the water. It has been 6 years since she first pressed the switch that brought the lighthouse back to life. 6 years since she signed papers that set her free. 6 years since she stopped trying to fit beside someone who never saw her and started building a life that saw itself. She thinks about her mother. About the letter that gave her permission to leave. About the wisdom that came too late to be spoken but early enough to be followed. She thinks about her grandfather. About the lighthouse he rebuilt after everyone said it was beyond saving. About the legacy he left in stone and glass and the careful documentation of his work. She thinks about the woman she was. The one who stayed quiet when she should have spoken. The one who gave credit when she should have claimed it. The one who shrank to fit beside a man who needed all the space in any room. That woman is gone now. Not forgotten, but transformed. Her silence has become strength. Her patience has become wisdom. Her careful attention to detail has become a gift she offers the world. Marin places her hand on the cold glass of the lantern room window. Below, the ocean crashes against rocks that have stood for millennia. Above, the stars continue their ancient patterns. She is 64 years old. She has loved and lost and rebuilt. She has discovered that the most powerful thing she ever did was stop fighting to be seen and start living as though she always had been. The lighthouse beam sweeps on, steady and patient, doing the work it was built to do. And Marin Caldwell, finally home, does the same. This is where the story ends. Not with revenge, not with confrontation, not with the satisfying destruction of someone who caused pain. It ends with something quieter, something truer. It ends with a woman standing in a lighthouse she restored with her own hands, watching light pour across dark water, knowing that she has become exactly who she was meant to be. Some stories are about the people who hurt us. But the best stories are about who we become when we stop letting them. Marin became herself. That was enough. That was everything. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If you found something in Marin's journey that speaks to your own, let me know in the comments below. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is where you are at. If you have ever walked away from something that no longer served you, if you have ever rebuilt your life on a foundation of your own making, if you have ever discovered that your worth was never dependent on being seen by someone who refused to look, then this story was for you. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear that quiet exits can be the loudest statements of all. And subscribe to Tales of Desire with Mr. Walker for more stories of heartbreak, redemption, and the complicated journeys that make us who we are. Until next time, remember this. You do not need permission to become who you have always been. You do not need applause to know your work has value. And you do not need anyone else to see you in order to know that you are worth seeing. The lighthouse keeps its watch. The waves keep their rhythm. And somewhere, on a coast you may never visit, a woman who once made herself small is standing tall in the light she built with her own hands. May you find your lighthouse. May you have the courage to restore it. And may you never again wait for someone else to tell you that you shine.